The sky above the Vale Citadel shimmered with bioluminescent arcs of light, the planetary aurora bathing the white stone towers in hues of lavender and gold, as ceremonial airships floated silently in their sky paths, each one adorned with banners of both the human-Terran alliance and the proud sigil of House Vialthira, the twin phoenixes entwined in silver and flame. But the grandeur of the day did nothing to ease the knot in Commander Rian Dorn's stomach as he stood alone before the ancient throne dais, flanked by alien guards who watched him not with curiosity, but veiled contempt, their hands never straying far from the hilts of their ceremonial blades. And ahead of him, upon a platform that glowed with living crystal, sat the ruling family of Vialthira, their eyes sharp, their skin luminous, and at the center of them all, with a posture carved from unyielding pride, stood Princess Aurelia, the last daughter of her line, revered across the Orion sector as both strategist and symbol, her long hair woven with threads of light, her silver blue skin flawless under the palace glow, her expression unreadable as her gaze fell upon him like the tip of a dagger. She wore armor laced with ceremonial gold, elegant yet battle-ready, and when she finally stepped forward to address him, the entire court fell silent, the music ceasing mid-chime, the great vaulted room echoing only with the soft resonance of her voice as she said, in standard, but with an edge that turned each word into ice, "Let it be known that I will not, under any condition, agree to a binding union with a human." And though Ryan had prepared himself for rejection, the weight of her words still struck like a blade to the chest, the diplomatic mask he'd worn cracking for just a second as murmurs rippled through the gathering, his heart pounding not from embarrassment, but from the unmistakable truth that her refusal was more than political. It was personal. Aurelia's eyes didn't just see him as a symbol of a foreign species. They saw him as lesser, a threat to her autonomy and the legacy of her people. And in that moment, the possibility of peace between their two civilizations, so delicately constructed, so tentatively held by treaties and compromise, wavered like a flame in a storm. But even still, Ryan kept his spine straight and his voice calm as he bowed low and responded, "Then let your will be honored, Princess. The Terran Alliance will not force a union, only offer one." And though it was the right thing to say, he knew the damage had already been done. The envoy behind him shifting with unease, the alien nobles exchanging glances, and somewhere, behind the shining masks of ceremony, the real powers began to stir, calculating, circling, waiting for weakness to exploit. After the ceremony ended, Ryan was led not to a feast but to a private garden where emissaries offered polite reassurances and thinly veiled warnings. And when he finally found a moment to himself under the night-blooming torva trees, he watched the stars alone and wondered, not for the first time, why he had agreed to be the face of such a fragile hope. Aurelia, for her part, returned to her chambers and removed her ceremonial armor in silence, her attendants watching her carefully, unsure if they should speak. And when they left her alone, she stood by the window and stared out over her city, its towers gleaming like blades of moonlight, and let her mask drop, just a little, just enough for the truth to slip through. She was afraid, not of Ryan, nor his kind, but of what it would mean to allow herself to see him not as a threat, but as a possibility. Because deep down, beneath the doctrines of blood purity and the weight of royal tradition, she had glimpsed something in his eyes, a quiet resilience, an honesty that refused to bow. And it unsettled her more than any worship ever could, because she had been trained to see diplomacy as strategy, alliances as moves on a board, and emotions as a dangerous indulgence. And yet here was this human, offering not dominance or submission, but partnership, and instead of considering it, she had cut him down in front of all the galaxy. But Aurelia had her reasons, ones the Council would never understand. Her mother's death, the failed rebellion, the whispers that the Vale bloodline was weakening, that the human alliance was just another leash disguised as peace. And so, she had refused, not just for herself, but for the memory of 1,000 years of sovereignty. And if her heart ached as she watched his ship lift off later that night, she told herself it was just diplomacy lost, not something more. But in the days that followed, strange things began to stir in the Empire. Movements in the outer systems, border stations going dark, trade routes being mysteriously rerouted, and whispers, always whispers, that the throne was no longer secure, that factions loyal to the old order were gathering strength, and though the High Council dismissed it as rumor, Aurelia knew better, felt it in her bones the way predators feel the shift in the wind before the hunt. And in a moment of weakness she summoned the classified reports, Ryan's files among them, and read, really read, the dispatches he had authored during the Drelvex campaign, the footnotes he had written by hand, the empathy in his language. When speaking of conquered peoples, the fury he unleashed when protecting civilians, and slowly, painfully, the image she had crafted of him, a brute in polished armor, began to unravel. Meanwhile, Ryan returned to the Terran flagship Resolute, found himself flooded with new orders. Step back, stand down, prepare for possible withdrawal, because the alliance was crumbling, and the rumors of an impending civil fracture in the Vial-Thyran Empire had made human diplomats skittish. And still he argued, quietly, carefully, that retreating now would only accelerate conflict, that they should send observers, support, aid, anything. But no one wanted to listen to the man who had just been publicly humiliated in front of an alien court, and so he spent his days pacing in silence, watching transmissions from Vaelthira flicker in and out, and wondering if he should have fought harder, not for the mission, but for her. And then one night everything changed. The emergency broadcast from Aurelia's capital arrived garbled and full of static, but the message was unmistakable. The Citadel is under attack. Internal betrayal. Casualties. Need immediate assistance. And though the Council forbade him from acting, citing neutrality and non-interference, Ryan made his choice in silence, suiting up and launching in a single stealth craft toward the embattled capital, dodging debris and automated defenses as he broke through the smoke and chaos of a city on fire, buildings collapsing in brilliant arcs of light, loyalist soldiers overwhelmed by precision strikes from within their own ranks, and amid it all he found her, crushed beneath the ruins of the great spirit spire, barely breathing, her legs pinned by twisted metal, her armor cracked and blood slicking the floor around her like a spilled galaxy. And for a moment, he froze, staring at her through the fractured mask of a princess brought low, not by an enemy but by those she had trusted most. And then he moved, hands bleeding as he tore at the wreckage, voice hoarse as he called her name, whispering half-remembered, Vial healing chants just to keep her conscious. And when her eyes fluttered open and fixed on him, filled not with pride or command but something raw and afraid, she rasped, Why? Why are you here? And he just laughed, bitter and beautiful, and said, Because no one else came. And then he lifted her onto his back, cradling her like something sacred, and began the long walk through burning streets, his body breaking under her weight and the burden of fire, drone strikes lighting up the sky above them. And all the while she whispered things he didn't understand, names, regrets, fragments of songs, and he listened, every word stitched into memory. Because for the first time she wasn't the untouchable heir of Vaelthira, she was simply Aurelia, wounded and fighting to live. And when they finally reached the edge of the city, and the rebel extraction ship lifted them from the ashes, he collapsed beside her and reached for her hand, not as a soldier, not as a suitor, but as someone who had come for her not because he was ordered to, but because he couldn't bear the thought of her light being extinguished. Not by war, not by betrayal, not while he still breathed. The stars above Vaelthira no longer shimmered with elegance, but flickered like fractured glass, half obscured by black smoke that curled up from the heart of the city like the breath of a dying god. And Aurelia Vial, once cloaked in command and certainty, now lay barely conscious in the ruined shadow of the spirit spire. Her ancestral tower collapsed around her like a fallen monument to all the things she had tried so hard to protect, her thoughts flickering in and out like fading starlight as pain radiated from her crushed legs and fractured ribs, every breath shallow, each second a war between slipping into the dark and clawing back toward something like life. And somewhere, beneath that agony, beneath the heat and noise and betrayal, was a single thought repeating like a whisper through her burning mind. This was not supposed to happen, because the warning signs had been there. Yes, in scattered intelligence reports, and flickering satellite feeds, in whispered rumors among the merchant fleets and strange silences in the palace corridors. But Aurelia had trusted too much in blood, in the idea that the family who raised her would never turn on her, that the council who bowed before her would never plot her death behind closed doors, and that belief, so foundational, so foolish, had almost killed her. It had begun with the silence of the stars, with 3 remote outposts blinking out within hours. Communications lost, no emergency beacons triggered, and then came the day of the convergence, a planetary celebration of peace where leaders from dozens of worlds gathered in her city under the illusion of safety. And at first everything had seemed perfect. Lights in the sky, laughter in the halls, ambassadors drinking starlight wine and making hopeful speeches, and Rian Dorn nowhere to be seen. His absence a quiet ache she refused to name. But then the power grid failed for exactly 13 seconds. Long enough for shield protocols to drop, for palace defenses to momentarily blink out. And in that window, death arrived in silence, cloaked and precise, led by those she had called uncle, friend, brother, the coup igniting not with an explosion but with the sound of poisoned air hissing into vents and blaster fire echoing in corridors once filled with song. She had run, not out of fear but strategy, dodging loyalists who turned traitor, pulling a fallen guard's blade from his ribs and fighting through 3 assassination attempts before reaching the central tower, where the throne's emergency beacon had been tampered with. And just as she activated the override, the upper spire detonated above her, the explosion hurling her into a cascading avalanche of stone and crystal, her last memory before the blackness being the shattering sound of her city crumbling around her. Hours passed, maybe more, and when she surfaced, barely tethered to life, the only light she saw was fire reflected in the cracked glass of the ruined dome. And she knew, with sudden clarity, that no help was coming from within her own ranks, because those who had not turned against her had already been slaughtered, and those who lived were watching, waiting to see if she would die quietly, conveniently. And so she lay there, blood pooling beneath her, lungs shuddering against broken ribs, trying not to let the cold claim her, her mind drifting to strange places, the memory of her mother's voice, a childhood promise made under the bloomvine trees, the warmth of Ryan's hand pressed to hers during a long diplomatic ride, the way he had looked at her not like a princess, but like a woman who still had choices. And she remembered how she had refused him, cruelly, publicly, and now that defiant distance seemed meaningless in the face of death because it was not a throne or a title she craved now, not survival even, but the chance to look into his eyes one more time and say what she should have said before pride sealed her mouth shut. And then, just as her heartbeat began to slow, footsteps echoed across the rubble, heavy, quick, human, and for one wild moment she thought she had conjured him in a fevered hallucination. But when the shadow dropped beside her and a familiar voice cursed softly, calling her name with a desperation that carved through the fog of pain, she realized he had come for her. He had come, not the council, not her guards, but him. And she tried to speak, to ask why, how, but only blood bubbled at her lips, and still he spoke, soothing and furious, hands already moving, scanning, lifting debris with bare hands and gritted teeth, ignoring the blood that ran down his cheek from a head wound, eyes wild with a mixture of horror and determination as he cradled her head and whispered, "Stay with me, Aurelia, just a little longer, I've got you." And in that moment she felt something break open inside her, not just from the pain, but from the realization that someone had chosen her, not the symbol or the sovereign, but the girl beneath it all, the stubborn, lonely creature who had never really believed anyone could love her for who she was beneath the armor of command. And then he was lifting her, fireman style, over his shoulder, and she bit down a scream as broken bones shifted. But he didn't falter, just kept moving, dodging falling debris and strafing drone fire, following a path only he seemed to know, pausing only to blast a hole through a collapsed corridor or reroute a security gate, and all the while she clung to consciousness by the sound of his voice. Stories of Earth's oceans, of sunsets on Mars, of the first time he had ever seen. Her, standing above the assembly with her chin high and her eyes blazing, and when she asked, voice weak and cracked, why he'd come back, he said, "Because I couldn't not." And that answer hit her harder than any explosion, because it was simple, true, and entirely without agenda. They made it to the extraction zone an hour later, both half dead, and collapsed inside a rebel medship where field medics swarmed her, while Ryan stood by the hatch, holding off one last wave of assassins with a blaster in one hand and a combat knife in the other, refusing to leave her side until the medic dragged him down and treated the gash on his thigh that had left a trail of blood across half the floor. And only then did Aurelia allow herself to close her eyes. Not from pain, but from the strange, searing knowledge that something had changed between them in those brutal hours. Not in words, not in declarations, but in the unspoken bond forged in fire and blood. And though her body would take weeks to heal, her heart had already begun to shift, quietly, irrevocably, toward the one man she had once believed unworthy of her. And when she woke later, wrapped in sterile sheets with the distant hum of the stars outside the medbay window, her first question wasn't about the city or the council or even her throne. It was about him, about whether he was still alive, still near. And when the medic nodded and gestured toward the recovery ward across the hall, where Ryan lay sleeping under sedation, one arm bandaged to the elbow and his face bruised but peaceful, she felt a pull inside her chest that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the future she had never let herself imagine. And, for hours, she simply watched him, learning the curve of his mouth when he dreamed, the way his hand twitched now and then like he was still fighting for her, even in sleep. And she remembered every moment of their escape, every word he whispered to keep her alive, and knew with growing certainty that something between them had begun that day, not as a treaty, not as alliance, but as something infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more precious. A bond. No council could mandate, no throne could control, and for the first time in her life she didn't feel alone in the universe. Recovery was never silent, not for someone like Aurelia Vale, not for a princess whose bloodline carried the weight of 1,000 years of rule, not for a woman who had been dragged from the jaws of death by the one man she'd once refused to trust. And so the medbay aboard the rebel starcruiser Vigilant Star became her sanctuary and her prison, where political news was whispered like poison through the walls and her every breath was monitored by machines singing quiet lullabies of survival. And though her bones began to knit and her strength returned day by day, her spirit remained suspended between two truths: what she had been and what she was now becoming, a metamorphosis that felt too fragile to name aloud. She spent hours at the window, watching stars bleed past in streaks of silver, and in those moments the weight of her ruined city pressed down on her lungs more than any injury. Because Valthera had not simply been attacked, it had fallen, crumbled from within like a cracked crown, and the betrayal of her own blood echoed louder than the distant war drums beginning to sound across her sector. But even that pain dulled in comparison to what lingered in her thoughts each time she looked toward the adjoining chamber, where Commander Rian Dorn lay recovering behind a translucent partition, his presence a quiet gravity that kept her tethered to something real. She remembered every step he'd taken through fire for her, the way his arms hadn't faltered even when she cried out from the pain, the way his voice never once lost its calm. And now that he was here, alive, sleeping in the bed beside hers, the ache she felt when she looked at him was not guilt, not duty, but something raw and tender, something she had been taught to excise and fear, want. They did not speak at first, not in the way two people speak when they have not yet broken the silence of survival, but they shared looks, long ones, heavy with everything unsaid. And it wasn't until the fourth day, when she was able to walk, with the help of an exobrace and he was sitting upright reading encrypted field briefings, that their silence cracked and he looked at her, really looked, and said with soft defiance, "I'm not sorry I came back." And she, without flinching, replied, "You shouldn't be." And though no one else in the room understood what passed between them in that moment, it was as if something clicked quietly into place, not like a door opening, but like a lock finally accepting its key. And so their conversations grew in stolen corners of the ship, on quiet decks where starlight spilled across the metal like frozen fire. and they talked not like enemies or allies, but like two people who had burned to the same frequency, who had bled together and come back changed, and she learned of his past, not through reports or diplomatic dossiers, but through memory. Stories he told with a slight grin and a soldier's weariness. Tales of a family lost to war, of years spent defending causes he didn't believe in until he met people who reminded him why he should. And he, in turn, listened to her, really listened, as she spoke of growing up in golden halls where affection was rationed like stardust, and expectations wrapped around her throat like silk noose, and how power had never tasted like freedom, only responsibility soaked in sacrifice, and the more they spoke, the less they hid, until even the silences between them felt like language. But the galaxy did not pause for recovery, and soon their stolen hours were interrupted by transmissions from loyalist enclaves, by urgent messages revealing that the coup had spread further than anyone feared, that the capital was no longer the center of a broken empire but merely its most visible wound. And when intelligence came through that Aurelia's cousin, High Regent Kalen, had declared himself sovereign of Valthira and ordered her captured on sight, the gravity of the situation shifted, and so did Ryan's role, from rescuer to protector, from ally to co-conspirator. And though no formal alliance was signed, everyone on the Vigilant Star knew that where she went, he followed, and where he stood, she stood beside him. Together they planned, carefully, quietly, piecing together what loyal cells remained, identifying safe zones, gauging whether any among the Terran Alliance would risk open support. And through it all, their closeness became both a comfort and a liability, because the deeper their bond grew, the more dangerous it became to acknowledge it aloud. And though Rian never said the words, and Aurelia never asked him to, it became unspoken doctrine between them, that when the time came to retake her world, they would do it side by side, not as ruler and envoy, but as something older and truer. Two souls who had chosen each other in the fire. And yet, even in the glow of this fragile new hope, darkness loomed, because Kalen's reach was long and his spies relentless. And one night, as the ship coasted through the Glacian expanse on silent drive, an assassin breached the outer hull, slipping past defenses with tech that could only have come from someone inside their own ranks, and Aurelia woke not to alarms, but to the sound of a blade being unsheathed inches from her throat, only for Ryan to move faster than thought, intercepting the strike with his forearm, the blade slicing through flesh to bone as he tackled the intruder, disarmed her, and drove. A stun rod through her neck with a snarl that belonged more to instinct than training. Blood pooled on the floor, his, not hers, and Aurelia knelt beside him as medics rushed in, pressing both hands to the wound like she could will the bleeding to stop, whispering his name over and over, her voice breaking for the first time since the war began. Because this, she could not survive, not again. And when he caught her wrist and said through gritted teeth, "I'm okay," she shook her head and whispered, "You're not allowed to die before I say it." And when he blinked, confused, dazed from pain and blood loss, she leaned in and whispered into his ear the words that had lived inside her since the moment he had lifted her from the ruins. "I want you, not as an ally, not as a weapon, just you." And then the sedatives kicked in and he slipped into unconsciousness, leaving her with the taste of her confession still warm on her lips. In the days that followed, they drew tighter around one another, no longer pretending that their connection was accidental. And though they still spoke in the careful language of war, their eyes betrayed the truth. They had become each other's center, and no amount of distance or duty could sever that bond. And so when the call finally came, when the signal lit up the encrypted relay from the last bastion of Vial loyalists in the southern spires, Aurelia stood in the command chamber of the Vigilant Star, her cape flowing like night behind her, and looked to Ryan not for permission, not for advice, but for presence. And when he stepped to her side, blood gone from his arm but resolve burning brighter than ever in his eyes, she knew they were ready, not just to reclaim a throne, but to rewrite the ending that had once seemed inevitable. The stars would burn for them, and this time she would not run and he would not retreat. And whatever the cost, they would face it together. War did not arrive with fanfare or the sound of distant horns. It came like a memory reawakened, like breath held too long finally let loose. And as Aurelia Vale stood on the deck of the Vigilant Star, draped in armor that shimmered like the dusk of fallen empires, she knew this was not a return but a reckoning, not just for her bloodline or her people, but for herself, because the girl who had once stood beneath the glass domes of Vaelthira, dreaming of peace, had died beneath the rubble of the Spirit Spire, and in her place stood a woman tempered by betrayal, resurrected by fire, and made whole not by destiny but by choice. The choice to fight not as a symbol, but as a soul unwilling to bow to injustice, even when it wore the face of family. And beside her always now stood Rian Dorn, his face set in the still focus of a soldier who had walked too far through darkness to ever turn back, his eyes never once straying from hers as the stars ahead glimmered with the distant shape of her homeworld, now occupied and broken, its surface marred by siege scars and the mechanical tumors of Kaelin's war machines. But Aurelia did not flinch, did not waver, because this was the fire they had chosen together, and she would not let it consume her without burning brighter than it ever could. And so the plan unfolded with the precision of lived fury, years of military instinct and rebellion whispers stitched into one daring operation. Strike from above in silence, break the orbital defenses from the inside, using stolen access codes smuggled out by loyalists still hidden within the command. Towers then descend through the storms and ash clouds, land beneath the shattered bones of the western city's underlayers, and rise from the ruins like ghosts returned to claim their names. And though the mission would be suicide for most, they did not hesitate, because Aurelia had learned something even more dangerous than politics or power. She had learned trust, not in systems or heritage, but in one man. And as the dropcraft screamed through Vale's fractured sky, turbulence tearing at its frame, she reached out across the narrow chamber and gripped Rian's hand, neither of them speaking, because words were hollow compared to what they had already lived through for one another. And as the craft hit ground, dust blooming around it like the breath of the dead, they moved as one, weapons drawn, armor humming with kinetic charge, the loyalist unit behind them rallying not to a banner, but to a woman who had crawled back from her own grave. And what followed was not a battle, but an eruption. Silent resistance turned loud, as pockets of hidden fighters rose from underground cells and storage hubs, striking out with precision while Aurelia and Ryan carved a path through the inner sanctums of the High Council Tower, each corridor painted in fire and betrayal, her cousin's guards falling in disciplined silence as they fought their way toward the throne room she had not seen since it became the seat of her usurper. They did not speak much during the fight, just hand signals, glances, the occasional barked order, but they moved like twin stars orbiting the same fury, covering each other's blind spots, shielding one another from sniper fire and thermal blasts. And as they ascended the final stairway lined with ancestral banners torn and desecrated, Aurelia's pulse did not race from fear, but from certainty, the kind that only lives in those who have faced death and returned knowing exactly what they want. And she wanted this, not just vengeance, but justice, not just a throne, but the right to love what she had once denied herself. The final confrontation came not with fire, but with silence as they breached the high doors to find Kaelin waiting, alone, flanked by two elite guards who dropped their weapons before Aurelia even spoke, their eyes wide with disbelief. Not just that she was alive, but that she had come back stronger, her aura blazing with something they had forgotten a ruler could carry: honor. And as Kaelin stepped forward, clad in royal colors he had not earned, he tried to speak, tried to justify the blood and betrayal with his usual cold logic, but Aurelia raised one hand and said simply, "I am not here to listen." And as he moved to draw a hidden blade, Ryan shot it from his hand without blinking, and what followed was not a trial, not a speech, but a single moment where Aurelia looked into the eyes of the man who had tried to erase her and said, "I remember everything," before activating the binding cuffs that sealed his fate, not with death, but with exile, the very punishment he had planned for her. And then the silence in the room broke, not with applause but with breath, a collective exhale from those who had waited too long for truth to return. And Aurelia stepped onto the dais not as the heir who had fled, but as the sovereign who had chosen to fight. her voice clear as she activated the comm beacon and spoke not just to her people, but to the stars. I am not the ruler you remember. I am the one who rose when memory failed you, and I will not rule alone. This world will not belong to bloodlines, but to those who earned it with sacrifice and loyalty. And when she stepped back, it was Ryan she turned to. His expression, unreadable, jaw clenched like he was waiting for the moment he would be asked to disappear into history's shadow. But she took his hand before he could turn, and said loud enough for the chamber to hear, "This man saved your queen. This man stood where others fled. I name him my shield, and more than that, my equal." And though he tried to object, to whisper something about lines not crossed and roles not meant to blur, she silenced him with a kiss, fierce and public and undeniably hers. And in that moment the war, the pain, the silence, they all fell away, and there was only this. Two souls who had chosen the fire, not because it was safe, but because it was theirs. The weeks that followed were turbulent, filled with reconstruction and negotiation, the delicate art of rebuilding not just walls and treaties but trust. And though Aurelia bore the burden of leadership with the same grace she always had, those closest to her saw the change, how she no longer carried it alone, how she deferred to Ryan in moments not out of obligation but belief, and how the fire in her eyes had not dimmed but deepened, tempered by a love she had once sworn never to feel. And every night when the halls finally fell quiet and the stars shone again through repaired glass ceilings, she would find him on the palace balcony where the air still smelled faintly of smoke and memory, and they would speak not of war or duty, but of dreams, of oceans yet unseen, of a life that might one day belong to no one but themselves. And though neither could know how long peace would last, or what new storms might rise on the horizon, they knew one thing with the certainty of gravity. They had survived together, and whatever came next, it would not be fate that shaped them. It would be choice, fierce and full of fire, and it would be theirs.